It is an honour to be back here and to be seeing the great work that CCL is doing. I hope you have a great night tonight, and I hope you've come with a pen ready to write down questions and can send them in. That'd be a really good thing. I want you to help me though by thinking about the last marriage that you were at. It may have been a while, it may have been last weekend. Just take yourself back there and think about that moment when you saw the vows exchanged. Are you there? Okay. This was from Four Corners last week. Terry Butler, the Queensland ALP Shadow Equality Minister, said this: "I was at a wedding on the weekend in Kingaroy, actually. When you're at a wedding now, you can feel the hurt when the celebrants are required to say the line about marriage being between a man and a woman. That's a hurt that's shared by everyone, really." And in that scene, she's there with the mother of a same-sex attracted child who's starting to break down. Her name's Sharon Faulkner, and she says, "It was my youngest son's wedding that put me on this path because I sat there and realised that my oldest son couldn't get married. And it hurts. It hurts. It hurts them and it hurts us." That pain was all too raw and all too real. And as she broke down in tears, you could see this wasn't something that was set up by the media. This wasn't some opportunistic moment by a politician. There was genuine pain and hurt there. And we need to hear that, not be dismissive of it. We need to know those stories that are taking place within our churches and beyond them as well, to see that there are people who at the moment genuinely feel that moment where the vows are exchanged, that marriage is between a man and a woman, that is a moment for hurt and for grief. Let me take you back to the very first wedding, the very first marriage, recorded in Genesis, and it says, "But for Adam no suitable helper was found. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. While he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man. He brought her to the man, and the man said, 'This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man.' That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. And Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. Bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh." As the Hebrew more literally has it, yabba dabba doo. This is the beginning of poetry. This is where we start as a race. There's something deeper here, something which is good, something which will prove to be so good it's definitely worth leaving a father and a mother for, to be united in one flesh in this way. This is how the earth is to be filled. This is how the world is to be ruled. This is what it means, in part, to be in the image of God. Jesus himself will go back to this passage to explain what marriage has always been about. So is marriage good? Which vision of marriage are we supposed to go along with? Is the wedding an occasion for hurt and grief? As those vows are exchanged, can we block out the thoughts that it might be some discriminatory, unjust, oppressive moment where pain is clearly being felt? Is marriage broken? And does it need to be redeemed and liberated and reformed so that it loses that gendered nature? No more this man and this woman, but instead two persons. Australian Marriage Equality, who are pushing for same-sex marriage in Australia, have a liturgy for straight marriages that want to be supportive of same-sex marriage. They give 5 options, and frankly, their liturgical page is much better than anything the diocese has. Really good set out, and the diocese could learn from it. But option 1 says this: you can say these words, and they suggest that it's done at the moment, just as the vows are given and before the kiss and so on. "As requested by partner 1 and partner 2, I think that it's a good time to pause for a moment and reflect on those couples in committed, loving relationships who cannot get married under current marriage law. Our thoughts are with them on this special day." Now, you might have been to one of those weddings. I know that there are more and more requests for it to take place like that. Certainly at the moment, when you prepare a couple to be married, you have to give them a pamphlet written by the government which reminds them that in the Family Law Act, marriage is the union of a man and a woman to the exclusion of all others voluntarily entered into for life. That's what the law says. That's what you have to put in people's hands. The pamphlet goes on to say, the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society. It's a worthwhile goal for all married people to try and achieve a strong marriage and family life. It's most important that you pass on your loving and stable family life, your pleasure and your wisdom about marriage to our next generation of Australians. Right? That's not a church drafting that. It's someone in an office in Canberra that's come up with that, right? And then they say anyone marrying someone has to give them that pamphlet. So you can see that we have very different and competing visions of marriage, clearly not easily reconciled at all. There's real kind of plurality of views which are out there. And the talk of a plebiscite, and I don't want to get bogged down into the mechanisms of that tonight, let that be a warning for those asking questions. The plebiscite has done one thing though, it's shown that there are clear divisions. And however you cut the numbers and whatever survey you believe, let's take it as I say, a 60-40 split, where 60 want change and 40 want marriage to remain as it is. If the government is going to set up a change to the law that affects something that is so deeply held, so important and so basic to society, it's really going to create a great fissure between that 40 and that 60. And what it proposes to do is not to say, well, you can have that view of marriage or that view of marriage, we'll recognise them both. Instead, it's taking a position. It's saying the law will change, and it will change in order to remove gender. So that it will be person one and person two. It won't be husband, it won't be wife. This is the understanding of marriage which we all must commit to as a nation. Now, let me say, at the moment, it may feel a little awkward talking about same-sex marriage, right? It might even be social death, you know, depending on your postcode and your friendship group, right? But if the law changes, it will be far worse than awkward. Suddenly, you will have 40% of the Australian population having a view which is out of step with the law. And that 40% will include those whose beliefs on marriage have come from a conservative kind of Christian understanding, one that matches the tradition and history of the culture, who suddenly will find themselves at odds with the law. Okay, so the question tonight is, can we talk about same-sex marriage? And the answer, I think, if that really is the question, is very simple. Yes, we can. In fact, I'm doing it right now. I want to say that we can do it privately, we can do it publicly. That's not to say that it's easy. It's not to say that it's going to always be persuasive. It's not to say that it won't come without a cost or a detriment. But to quote Obama, yes, we can. We can talk about marriage. I want to persuade you, though, that it's worth doing it, that it is worth speaking about it, that it is a good thing that we should do. And as I say that, I understand there is a pressure not to speak. You know, I feel that every day. Freedom for Faith is a Christian think tank. It's there to, and if I can correct your typo, protect and promote religious freedom in Australia. And so as we do that, I've got to say, it's a hard time to be arguing for religious freedom. You know that as well. You know, the freedom to believe. But let me tell you some of the reasons. First, in a post-9/11 world, most people aren't too crazy about letting religious people do what they want to do, right? Because they may well just fly into buildings or do something like that would cause terrible harm. In France, just this week, we've seen serious discussions from mainstream parties saying, let's just ban all signs of religious garb, everything. You know, we want to control the security risks around Islam, so therefore let's say no more Stars of David, no crosses, no nuns in habits. It all has to go, all because of our civic freedoms. That's one reason. Second reason is because of the terrible evil that has been done through clerical abuse of children and through the institutional cover-up of that. Right? These are not good days to be saying, just trust the church, just allow believers to do what they want to do. And rightly so. That's good that that's coming to light. It's right that that causes us problems. But the context in which this debate around same-sex marriage is coming up is also where there's been a broad, progressive social justice movement taking place that sees Christianity really as part of the problem. And that movement has captured people that would have traditionally been on the left and the right. And what was on the fringes of kind of academic debate 10 years ago in terms of religious freedom is now being quite mainstreamed into party platforms. There's no easy home for Christians anymore when it comes to finding political beds to kind of lie in. No one is significantly pushing back against this change of law that is suddenly seeing equality rights being elevated in ways that they've never been before, that is seeing discrimination laws being used to recognise not just access or equity issues, but people's dignity, their inherent kind of worth, their value as people needs to be protected in all kinds of ways, like speech that we'll get to. At the same time, the stock of marriage generally has fallen, and that's not the fault of the LGBTI community. You know, as people go into cohabitation and de factos, as less people marry in churches, as more people are divorced, as more marriages break down, then it's hard to argue for marriage. You know, if people had believed more in how good marriage is, I don't think we'd be having this conversation at all. And those that do want to push it, well, the only people standing up really for this conversation in a significant numbers are Christians. Christians who are no longer kind of tolerated but seen as a threat to this broader movement. Now, I don't want to get all conspiracy theory about this and suggest that there's some, coalition of pink, same-sex marriage, LGBTI groups that are, planning to overthrow Christianity. This is not a Dan Brown novel, right? We're not in that universe. It's not real, right? But there is a cultural movement against Christianity, which we can recognise. In our church, in the last year, we were doing some evangelism training, and as I was setting up supper, I noticed that someone had left a carton of milk at the back of the fridge, and it had obviously been there several months. And it had all kinds of layers to it, and it was quite revolting. And I brought it out and kind of revealed it to say, this is how people see Christians at the moment, right? Something which is a bit on the nose, something which has gone beyond just offensive to quite dangerous. You don't want to let your kids near this, and the responsible thing to do would be to chuck it out, right? That culture wasn't around 20 years ago. Not the milk culture, you with me, right? That's the change that's kind of taking place. That's the world that we're in. And in that world, there's no longer an agreed kind of external source of moral values. Let's just say what the elders said. Let's look to the scriptures. The law is very clear on this. We'll just follow the law. Instead, the law becomes the kind of contested place where we can't agree what the marriage should look like or what the good life should be. And so we all kind of appeal to the law to rule in our favour, to show that we're the ones that are in the right, to declare that our position is legitimate, and to use the law to kind of enforce our position against others, to show that we're the ones who really are being recognised on both sides. That's taking place. So all those things are taking place, and it has made for a perfect storm. It is, of course, a storm that has been brewing longer than just the last 10 or 20 years. You could trace back this into the Enlightenment and beyond. The book to claim that you've read on this is A Secular Age, right? For those of you who are theological students, you'll know that big fat tome, that says the world that we're in is different. Now, we're in a position where it is quite possible to not believe in God. And many people would take that position. That was not the case 500 years ago. Before the Enlightenment, we're not in that kind of world. Now, if you're not into reading great big fat tomes, let me point you in the direction of a couple of movie and television references which show the same thing. One Christmas, I got Wolf Hall and the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo for Christmas, and I read them back to back. Right, Wolf Hall, 16th century Tudor England, middle of the Reformation, as they're kind of figuring out whether how Henry VIII's marriage should be recognised or not recognised, has some particular resonances to some debates around today, but it is a universe which is saturated with God and prayer and scripture, and some of the priests are heroes, right? So you're kind of reading that, and there's this universe which is created, which is just full of supernatural stuff. And then, close that, finish it, wonderful book, highly recommend. Read The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and you're in 21st century Sweden, and you are in a godless universe. It's like a completely different world which is being described. There's just no God there. There's no prayer. There's no higher kind of sense of right and wrong. It's bleak. It's amoral. The sex is brutal. The relationships are tough. There is but the faintest kind of light traces of church when you meet the pedophile priest. That's it. What's happened during those 500 years? Well, that's when the storm was brewing, right? And I think what's happening now is that the storm is hitting. And it's one of those moments where empires shift and thinking changes, and when you're in the middle of it, it's hard to read the signs and understand what's going on, because you're just trying to hold on and batten things down. But understand this, we're in the middle of change at the moment, and everyone's trying to get their heads around it, and everyone's scared to put their heads up and to speak. So while the presenting issue is same-sex marriage, there's deeper issues there about secularism, about how it is that people of faith can live in a pluralist world. So yes, we've seen massive changes to understandings of marriage and homosexuality over the last 30 years. You just look back to the first Mardi Gras, where the Sydney Morning Herald outed the 53 that had been arrested and beaten up by the police. They named them. Now, what do they do now? It's probably a rainbow cover on the Herald. That's right, isn't it? I don't know, I'm making that up. But, there's been a massive shift that's taken place in that short period of time, but it owes its origins to these deeper things which are going on. So why speak into that kind of situation? Let me give you 4 reasons. First reason, marriage is good. Marriage is really good. God's designed it. He's made it between a man and a woman. And there's something wonderful when a man and a woman come together to be united as one flesh, when they open themselves up to family that will come from that union. Marriage is a good thing. It's not the ultimate thing, but it is a good and wonderful thing. Second reason to speak, love your neighbour. If it is a good thing, then we want that good thing for our neighbours. We don't want marriage to be changed, to change its shape, to be redefined, for the culture to step further away from marriage. Thirdly, there are unintended consequences which will flow for children, for family, for the way marriage is done. And fourthly, there are unintended consequences for all kinds of civic freedoms, including freedom of speech. So for those kind of reasons, I want to say there's a really positive case for speaking marriage up and for saying this is worth holding on to. We just had some French journalists downstairs who they're going through the same kind of questions in France at the moment. And one of the first questions is, you're against same-sex marriage. Tell me why. Well, hang on, before we talk about what we're against, can we talk about what we're for? Frame it in a positive kind of way to say we're for marriage. And we think it's so good that we don't want to kind of change it lightly. Let's think carefully about it. And I don't want to be the person standing up, speaking out against the LGBTI community, as though there was some conspiracy there or as though they are the enemy. There is a broader cultural movement that is taking place at the moment, and we need to decide whether we're going to be part of the culture or try and escape from it. We need to say, well, has God got something good to say into this culture in a time of confusion? Or are we going to kind of hold on to this thing for ourselves? See, when God gave marriage to humanity, it wasn't just to his people. It wasn't just for Christians. It wasn't just for Israel. It wasn't just for the church. It was for the benefit of all men and women, not just for believers. So what are we to do with that? Do we then just keep it to our own community, or do we impose it on the community which is out there? Well, the answer is neither. We're called instead to love our neighbour. We're called instead to be faithful citizens, which means in Australia at the moment, secular liberal democracy, we should speak as citizens, not claiming some special privileged status that imposes beliefs on others, but as citizens with rights. Just as Paul, appeals to Caesar, we too should be appealing and saying, here is a good thing which we have to share, which will be for the good of others. We're not going to be the ones to enforce this on anyone. We're actually just saying, how is it that we decide to live together? What is it that the state should do with these competing claims? Again, it's love for neighbour. We need to share the good. We need to warn of the bad. And because Christians have been largely silent about this, it's only sometimes the shrillest voices which get heard speaking against same-sex marriage, speaking of the dangers, of the consequence of removing gender from marriage. Let me say that, as Tony said, we're not tonight going to repeat all of that, in terms of the case for marriage and for children and so on. But let me talk about the area that Freedom for Faith has a particular kind of focus on, and give you a quick kind of overview of some of the consequences we think are out there for freedom. The first thing that you need to know about is free speech. Archbishop Porteous. How many people have heard of Archbishop Porteous? Right. You all need to know this story. Archbishop Julian Porteous is the Catholic Archbishop of Hobart, and the Catholic bishops around Australia decided to, in the current climate, write a little booklet on marriage. And they called it Don't Mess with Marriage. I've read it. It is deliberately a very calm, peaceful, measured kind of document. Its understanding of marriage is a little different from the one I'd have. It's more sacramental than a Protestant would have, but it's hardly controversial stuff, right? There's respect for all, and it was very carefully kind of drafted. But Australian Marriage Equality Director Rodney Croom came out and said, look, if you've seen this booklet, we want you to complain about it. And it was distributed to Catholic parishes and to Catholic schools in Tasmania. And after that urging, Martine Delaney, LGBT activist, Greens candidate in Tasmania, came forward with a complaint to the Human Rights Commissioner. And the Human Rights Commissioner backed that up and said, this looks like hate speech. You have a case to answer for teaching what your church holds to be true about marriage. You are causing offence and harm and hurt to people, and that may well be actionable at law, right? And so the Catholic Church, they're calling the lawyers in, and they're trying to figure out what should be next. And it went on between November 2015 to May 2016. Lead up to the election, it was quietly kind of dropped because press was starting to take more of an interest in it. But the press should have been on this on day one, because this is an issue for free speech. Whatever your views are on marriage, do we really want to have a culture where you can't teach this view, where this view is so out of step that we can't even allow children to hear it? Now, it's not just that it accords with Catholic teaching, it was also a statement of what the Australian law is on marriage. It's not as though the law has changed. What do you think will happen if the law changes? And you're teaching that marriage is actually, regardless of what the law says, that marriage is really about a man and a woman. See, I think more people should be prepared to get calls from the Human Rights Commissioner. We're expecting to have more calls at Freedom for Faith if this takes place. And what would you say in that situation? See, some churches are facing that at the moment. A number of churches in the FIEC network, Lakes Church, Hunter Church, Maitland Bible Church, have been the subject of complaints on sexuality. It's made SBS, it's made the news, letters to government, and all because they're in public high schools, which is a privilege, but they're in public high schools teaching on the Bible's position on sexuality. What would you say to the principal in this situation when the person bringing the complaint says they shouldn't even be allowed to meet there? We shouldn't have this kind of stuff being taught. Similar issues at Sydney University about the freedom of a group to meet and to say, we insist on you being a Christian to be part of the leadership of this group and membership of this group, open to all, but membership for Christians. See, in this kind of climate, some churches have kind of smelt the wind and have gone radio silent. So I know a number of churches where they just will not teach on this stuff anymore. They'll say, we believe this traditional kind of understanding of marriage, what the Bible's saying, but we're not going to teach it from the front. Maybe in small groups, but not from the front anymore. Long before any law changes, that's taken place. Tony's already referenced the debate we've had about the plebiscite and whether we'll be allowed to speak into this situation, whether people can be trusted with it. I think the comeback to that is to say it wasn't that long ago that there were plenty of Greens who were pushing for the plebiscite. It wasn't that long ago that even Penny Wong was supportive of marriage as being between a man and a woman. What did she say? On the issue of marriage, I think the reality is there's a cultural, religious, historical view around which we have to respect. Now, she's changed her position. That's fine. She's entitled to do that. But those words are calm, measured, respectful, and they're not bigoted. They're not bigoted. They're not hateful. They're certainly not homophobic. See, it is quite possible to make the case without resorting into that kind of hateful caricature. It's important that we do actually have the kind of democratic culture where that takes place. But if the law were to change, I want to say all that's up for grabs. A night like tonight might well be construed as hate speech. Teaching what the Bible says on homosexuality could well land you into trouble. Now, I don't want to get alarmist about that, but nor do I want to be naive. The people pushing for this are the very ones who are saying, take away the rights of Christians to have exemptions under the anti-discrimination laws. We see the same issues come out with taxation, whether the charity status of churches, of welfare agencies, should be linked to equality, compliance, government tendering, the same kind of thing. Will church schools have the freedom to continue as they have? So you can look to Victoria and see where each of these kind of things have been chipped away at. The international experience tells us that if you work in certain professions, in counselling, in psychology, and even as a GP, in Canada, lawyers who signed a covenant of sexual fidelity, those kind of training institutions and Christians in those secular spheres are no longer being given the freedom to work. Registrars like Lillian Liddell in the UK, who said on conscience grounds could not follow through on this kind of registration of same-sex marriages, terminated. Adrian Smith, housing manager in Manchester, is demoted, has his salary cut by 40% because on Facebook he wrote, "This is an equality too far." That's it. Now, the court, in the end, a year of litigation on, actually found in his favour. And he was awarded £89 by way of recompense. And he wasn't reinstated. Now, we're not in that world yet. But if you want a vision of what that future looks like, look to the places where it's not the parliament setting the law, but the corporation, where the HR policy is saying to you, you must not speak on religion, and this is the corporate position on LGBTI issues. See, that gives you a vision of the world that we may well head into. That means that if all this does change, then the state has to get bigger and has to intrude into more and more of our lives in order to do that. And so you get the kind of situation where you have in the UK where the government Ofsted inspectors are going around to faith schools to check out their position on same-sex marriage. What is it that these people are being taught? And how are the kids being treated who are coming out as LGBTI? What are you doing for them? Now, that's a big leap, isn't it? Where you have a state suddenly stepping into the school to set up that kind of situation. So how do you feel in that kind of situation? Well, how does it make you think if that is the future? I think a lot of people have expressed feelings of confusion, of impotence, of anger even. I came across a great podcast just last week called The Devil in the Deep Blue Sea, where someone gave a great image of how they felt, and they said, I feel like Sarah Connor in the Terminator movies, where you know that there's this terrible bleak future which is coming and you're preparing your child for it, but even saying it aloud makes you sound crazy, right? If you're not across the Terminator movies, you really need to be. Or this will make no sense. But then they kind of stepped back and said, but I don't want to sound too crazy and alarmist about it. And which is good, because we don't want to think that we are going into some kind of apocalyptic Sarah Connor kind of universe. That can't be a Christian position, can it? When we think of the future, and when we think of the apocalypse, we think of the book of Revelation. That's our apocalypse, right? And that's very realistic about the dangers that Christians will face. You read chapters 2 and 3 and you see the churches which are described there, they're all going to face persecution, every one of them. But they're not called to change Rome and solve every problem in the world. They're called to faithfulness. And they're to do it knowing from chapter 1 that Jesus is in control, right? That he's watching over his churches, that even Rome itself won't have power. They do it knowing that by the end of the apocalypse, you see a beautiful picture of the church. And it's a picture of a wedding. That's the picture of restoration that we're to look forward to. It's not actually going to be about, the right parliamentary position on the Marriage Act. That's not our hope. We'll faithfully stand there and do what we can into that space. But our hope has to be much bigger. And that's got to change our stance, doesn't it? It allows us to speak with confidence, allows us to speak without fear, allows us to speak without feeling as though we need to retreat in order to be safe. Now, I hope you feel safe here tonight, because in the Middle East right now, on the plains of Nineveh, Christians are dying for their faith. Do they have freedom to talk of Christ? Well, they are. They're standing up and they're talking. Now, whatever we face here is not like that. So I think we need a level of perspective that says, be brave, be confident, be faithful in that situation. We can't be people who are just kind of nostalgic for the past, saying, let's do ministry like it was done 50 years ago, and let's see marriage kind of argued for so that it goes back to that. We've actually got a much better vision of marriage to a very confused world that needs to hear it. How do we speak it? Well, we'll hear more of that from Tony, but the one thing I'd want to say is that while there's a place for Christian politicians and people in that kind of sphere, the real action is at a grassroots level. The mistake they made in the UK with same-sex marriage was to put all their eggs into the kind of public debate and into media, and not equipping the ordinary church to kind of say, it's okay to speak about this, and we can speak with confidence. Have a go. Be there. History is decided by those who turn up, all those kind of things. I'm going to stop there because I don't want you to lose question time, and Tony's going to help us with questions, and then we'll see how we go. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michael. We're going to have 2 question times tonight, just to kind of keep you awake and keep you going, and because I suspect there will be question times. Lots of questions. We're going to have about 10 minutes of questions now, specifically on what on what Michael has asked, and he's run quickly over a few topics that you might want to ask him to clarify or dig deeper on. Then I'll give a shorter talk for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have an open question time before supper. So if you don't get your question in the next few minutes, don't despair. There will be another chance later in the evening. So let me throw it open to you. Bouncing off what Michael has just said and the various many things he's ranged across in the last few minutes, do you have questions that you'd like to ask about this difficult subject? Now, I'm going to just quickly repeat and summarise each question for the sake of the video. The question is, given that speaking on this subject really is speaking about something that's currently the law, defending something that is currently in existence and is legal, how do those on the pro-same-sex marriage side, how do they answer or justify that complaint that I'm being howled down and shut down merely for speaking about something that's perfectly, totally legal? What's the response?
Look, I think most people just don't accept that it's an issue. And so we've been in conversations with the Attorney General and the Shadow Attorney General, and they both take the same position that if there's any problems, it'll be resolved at a state level. They don't think there's an issue. They don't think that any of the changes to marriage acts need any kind of protection for freedom of speech. So they want to be... Now, there's some political wisdom in that. They don't want to say there are problems, even if they might be aware of them, but they want to say it's not an issue. This is just alarmist. So how would they respond to it? They'd say, this is alarmist, don't take this seriously. To which I'd say, look at Archbishop Porteous and look at the international experience.
Actually, can I follow up with a question of my own? In that kind of, it's my privilege as the chairman here. In terms of you talked about our engagement, a grassroots engagement, and that very often a far more effective thing is for ordinary people to speak up. If we were to go into our local parliamentarian's office, which is a great way to do it, or write them a letter, and we would want to say, look, I want 10 or 15 minutes of your time just to tell you I'm really concerned about this issue, what would you suggest we say to our parliamentarian? What would be our talking points?
Look, I'd be honest and say how you're feeling and talk from the position that you're actually in. Don't go with a script that comes from someone else. And they will listen because they understand fear and numbers, right? And so if they start having conversations with 20 people on one subject, that does catch attention. All of this is logged. There's a good database of everything that takes place for every political party, and they listen. And so at a straight kind of pragmatic level, you want your voice to be heard, then just call up and make an appointment and speak. And even if you don't win the argument, that you've tried to say something there and that your friend has done the same, well, there's plenty of seats in Australia that are held by 1%, 2% margins, right? Federal seat's about 90,000 members. My maths isn't strong. Someone help me. What's 1%? 900. You think 900 people might change their vote on this issue? See, at the moment, if no one goes and talks to them about it, they don't think they will. If suddenly there's 10, 20, 30, 40 people saying, I feel strongly enough about this that I'd change my vote, then, they understand numbers and they understand fear, and that's how it kind of works.
Thanks, Michael.
You won't find that in the Bible. That's just...
Oh no, I'm certainly there are things in the Bible about politicians and their ways. But over to you and to other questions. Yeah. The question is, by speaking about free speech and making that one of our issues, do we risk being lumped together with a different agenda, a much harder right libertarian agenda that is against against all limitation to speech, for example, against all racism or discrimination legislation? Is that a risk for us, do you think?
Absolutely, yeah. And you can see it in America with Trump at the moment. It's a real risk. And so how do you counter it? Well, you speak to politicians of all parties about it. So say to Labor, why do you want to have a conscience position that won't allow Christians to exercise their conscience post-2019? Say to the Greens, look, I love what you're doing and you love what we're doing on refugees, but can we please talk about your position on... Because we don't want to be just captive to a conservative agenda. And there'll be points at which we want to say a plague on both their houses, absolutely.
Sure. Other questions? Question is, given the secular nature of our times and the movement that's not only happened but is continuing, what would success look like were we to speak up? What sort of outcome might we hope to see?
Well, I think you go all through Scripture for this, but the more I've looked at the book of Revelation, the more I see that you don't necessarily get to choose the times that you're in, but you're called to be faithful wherever it is. And you're not promised even the outcome of what that faithfulness might look like. It may well just look like more persecution. It may not look like an effective political or cultural kind of change. But we're playing to a much longer agenda, and that gives us a kind of freedom to ask the question, what does faithfulness look like? Prayerfully have a go and see what God does with that.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah. So the question is, good question, is there might we be wiser to save this topic, as it were, for later in our relational conversation with someone, and to talk about the more central questions of the grace of the gospel and of Jesus Christ, rather than wading in on this topic? Now, I'll have something to say about this in my talk. It's almost exactly what my talk's about, but Michael, I'll give you a shot.
I think I should just defer, find out. Yes, sometimes, but not always. So I don't think it's a good operating principle that kind of says, well, I'm going to wait till they're really, converted, and then I'm going to talk to them about this. Because I think sometimes the threat and the challenge to the gospel, is Jesus really Lord, will come at these kind of points. And so it's probably not your opening social gambit, is my guess, but it might be if you have very unusual friends.
I think we might pause there, given the time, and given that that's such an excellent segue into the next topic.